is centered on the origin. This way, if you want to use symmetry, you can do that. There's not going to be any issues with, you know, if you have to like mirror an object over, it's not going to like cause any bizarre issues like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale this down into something that's maybe a little bit closer to the proportions of this light. Cool. Great. Alright, so the first thing that, if you haven't done smooth modeling before, the first thing to be aware of is, like right now, obviously this looks like a cube, and that's fine. But if we hit the 3 key, like obviously this loses a lot of volume and looks absolutely nothing like this light. So what you need to do, if you want something to, for example, you know, have a hard edge, like for example, if we look at the corner of this, or like the edge of this, where this little black area is, this is not rounded really at all. It's an extremely hard edge. So if we want that effect with smooth modeling, you need to add basically one loop. I usually call them like holder edge loops on each of your main loops that like sort of define where the side is. So basically, if I grab my insert edge loop tool, I'm going to go ahead and add a loop there. So if we smooth that, you can see that this shape has changed very dramatically because of that loop. It also makes that edge a little bit harder. So if we go out of my insert edge loop tool and turn off that, because I don't know, I find it really hard to model with this. To me, it just makes it feel like really weird for some reason. But again, you can see we get a little bit of a harder edge there. So it's not perfect, it's not ideal. So what we want is also another loop on this side of the edge, right? So we have, like I said, you have your main edge, which is this one here. And then we have one loop on one side, we need the other loop on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and hit G to repeat my last command, which is the insert edge loop tool. I'm going to go ahead and add that loop in. And you can see that now we have this really pretty nice looking like hard edge here. I'm also going to assign, because I feel like it's a little bit easier just to see what's happening with a blend. It'll give you a little bit nicer sort of shine. It helps to see the contours. I don't render with blends, I just think they're nice for the viewport. Alright, so basically that is, you know, one edge done. So what I would want to do is go around and do that basically for all of the rest of the edges. So if it's the little bottom one, we actually already have the one loop that we put in from the top. So we just need the one loop here, and then do the same thing to the other side. Now if I was actually thinking, I would have turned on symmetry for this. So I'm going to go ahead and turn, this looks like symmetry, so I'm on the z-axis here, so this is symmetry z that I want for object mode. Alright, so this is the basic sort of shape of the light. There is one other thing that I want you guys to be aware of, and that is that UV seams tend to show up a lot weirder on seams on smoothed objects depending on where you put the seam. So I just randomly threw in a checker texture here, and I'm just gonna like make this cool. See, this is the square UVs provide an excellent example of terrible looking seams. But basically you can see, particularly on the side seam here, there's an extreme amount of distortion. So if we look at this unsmoothed, it looks pretty much fine, but smoothed, you get like this, again, really bizarre distortion. So there's a few things, I mean, there's not a whole lot you can do to actually avoid it, particularly like on the side of an object here. But there is some stuff that we can do to prevent this really, really god-awful stretching, like right along here on the top. And it also involves adding more edge loops. So what I'm going to do is just go in again to my insert edge loop tool, and what we can do is add in one more loop on the side. Now the other thing to be aware of as you're adding in loops to things is the farther, I'm just going to make a demo cube, the farther your loop is away from the edge, the less effect that's going to have, or like the softer your edge is going to be. So if you don't want an extremely hard edge like this one here, what you can do is add your loops a little bit farther from the edge, so you still have that, again, your sort of main defining edge loop here. You have one edge on the side and then another one on the other side. But when we smooth this, you can see instead of this hard loop, we get this very nice sort of rounded corner. So stuff like this is usually how I would advise doing something like, you know, the corner of like a switch control, or other things with round edges, I guess. very specific. Also, I guess the corners of this like newer light is something like that I'm going to do for that as well. All right, so yeah. So what we can do with this, so we smooth this, and this is still like a reasonably hard edge. It's like not super crazy hard, but you can see that after we added that loop, the stretching is at least, it's not fixed, but it's pushed over to the sides. It's not like just aggressively on the top of your model for no apparent reason. So the other thing we can do with this, obviously, is, you know, just make a better UV layout to begin with. So I'm just going to take a brief aside into UVing. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop it on the audio channel or in chat. I just sort of keep going and assume that if nobody asks questions, then you guys are all just sort of like good and just, you know, watching stuff. All right, so if I pop this open, what I'm going to do is actually just go ahead and make a an automatic map on this object. And that did actually work. So this is where hiding UV seams becomes really important, particularly for smooth modeling. So what I would want to do for this object is basically squish my UV seams, minimize them on like long giant edges where they'd be super noticeable. So by re-UVing this object a little bit, that planar map actually did not great things. Normally it doesn't squish the sides that much. I'll probably tweak the setting. But anywho, but by limiting the sides or like changing where those seams are, you know, obviously we have much less issues with the seams, whereas this is going to be significantly less problematic than a giant seam running across the top of the object. So also you guys can do UVing kind of like whenever you want. A lot of times I'll just sort of UV as I go because I think it's just like easier to deal with. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is the difference between the sew tool and the move and sew tool. So in the end, they all give you pretty much the exact same result. Once you do an unfold, it doesn't really make a difference. Functionally, the difference between the two is if I do cut and sew, what that's going to do is leave both shells in place and just mush the edges together. So this, you know, obviously here has created catastrophic distortion and really aggressive overlapping on the UVs, which is entirely undesirable. If you do a move and sew, what it'll do is it'll pick one of the shells and it'll physically move it over to the other ones. So that's the one that I usually use. I find it just sort of saves a little bit of distortion a lot of times, and it just sort of makes things easier to figure out what's going on. But it doesn't really matter. Like I said, once you do an unfold, the UVs will pretty much look exactly the same anyway. It's just really a preference on, you know, how you guys prefer working. And then both sew and move and sew will also work. Like if I did something really crazy, like just for some reason, you know, cut all of these UV seams, if I just cut all those UV seams on like the same model, in this case, cut and sew and move and sew are going to behave exactly the same. So I usually will just, again, I use move and sew because it works for individual shells as well as things on the same thing, and that way I can just hit G to repeat the last command and it saves me button clicks. But yeah, so that's my quick bit on UVing, I guess, for this. Let us move right ahead. Alright, so this is, I'm just going to say this is like fine for the main shape of the object. What I might want to do though, because again, you can see that these edges are a little bit more rounded than the ones on the side, and we're not quite getting that from this. So what we could do is come through and grab these edges here. Maybe it's symmetry X? What is going on? Actually, no, I've just messed up symmetry for this object, so we're just going to ignore it. But what we can do is actually grab this and just sort of, if we drag this down, basically making it a little bit farther away from the top, we do get that rounder edge, and this still does a pretty good job of holding its edge here. So this is something that is not at all uncommon to do. Feel free to do this when you're modeling your objects. In this case, like I said, if this edge here is not causing any issues by being a little bit warped, don't even worry about it. And then just kind of push that over. So this is basically smooth poly modeling. So rather than just like creating this edge with a bevel, we're just doing it in a way that's a little bit easier to modify. Again, like if we needed to change that curvature, we can just shift an edge loop around. You don't need to like modify 8 loops in a bevel kind of thing. So same basic difference over here. And if you're thinking ahead, you can do both of these and just sort of scale them closer to each other. Probably works a little bit easier. And again, now we have something that resembles the object a little bit more closely. But moving right along, so let's say that we want to get these little black, whatever these rubber things are on the side. That is a thing that, if you were so inclined, you could model them in as a separate object. For something like that, I think it's easier to just sort of pop in a little loop or something on the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use multi-cut tool because I just like the multi-cut tool. Hey, and symmetry is working. So what I'm going to do is just say, all right, that looks like about where the little black line ends. Oof. Hello. Well, that's not what I asked for. Let me try turning symmetry off. That was weird. Alright, weird. I'll just do it on one side and we'll just move on. Alright, so this loop I laid in here is, imagine that if I had reference in here, this is going to be basically like right along the divide between that black and silver area. And then, same thing we did before, I need one loop on the inside. Wrong edge. I need one loop on the inside and then one loop on the outside of that. So off the bat, I mean, this doesn't really do much of anything, but if we grab this center loop, this is not the most elegant way to do this, but it kind of works. We can scale that down a little bit, and just be aware that rectangles do not scale well. They will scale very non-uniformly, so you will normally need to like shrink the short end manually a little bit more. But by doing that, we get that little sort of divot there. And in this case, it's being a little bit weird, and it's being a little bit what I call pulley, where if we look at this side edge here, so let's just sort of like follow this. So this is unsmoothed. If we smooth this, this is getting sucked way the heck into the center of this object. And it's also causing a little distortion down here where you can see that like the bottom of this is like, it's kind of gotten like wiggly, and it's not perfectly straight. Like this is pretty much straight. So what we can do is add in another edge loop in here, just sort of like a holder edge loop for this little loop here. So now if we smooth it, we should get, that's the loop that's going to get sucked into the center of the object, and that's fine, but this edge stays a little bit truer to what it should be. Also by doing this, we get, a really convenient, when you're UVing this, you can just sort of grab this little seam here, split everything on the side off, texture that as rubber, and then do everything else silver. Alright, so we could do that to the other side. I'm not going to. What I'm actually going to do for fun is, I know some of you guys have needed to mirror your objects. So in this case, like if I've messed up symmetry like I've done, because I'm a homicidal maniac, I'm just going to go ahead and delete half of that object. And this is actually why I recommend modeling stuff centered on the origin. So what I did is basically deleted half my object. I'm using snapping, grid snapping, so that's X on the keyboard. Shoot, I turned off the overlay. Hang on. Somebody requested that I put the little overlays back on the screen, so in the recording there should be a little overlay of what keys I'm using. Again, not a thing on Blackboard, but will be a thing in the OBS recording. Alright, so what you do is basically X will activate grid snapping. You can see that little thing will toggle up here. And then I just snap that edge loop right to this origin here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and duplicate. I'm going to freeze transformations on this object. Actually, I'm going to not do that because this is a good example. I'm going to duplicate this and be like, all right, I need this scaled on the -z. So what I'm going to do is, since this has, if this was all 1, you would just enter -1. Since this is some kind of weird scaling I did and didn't freeze it, you just enter negative in front of whatever that number is, hit enter, and it'll mirror it perfectly across the origin. So the nice thing about this is, again, if your stuff is on the origin, it makes it very, very easy to reduplicate half your object if you've done something dumb and then you need to redo that. The only other thing you want to do before going forward is make sure that you freeze the transformations on this. And then obviously these are still 2 separate objects, so, we need to go back and attach them together. So just do a mesh combine on these, and then you can do arg. What you can do is an edit mesh merge. So that, for the most part, unless apparently your tolerance is set to 0, which I don't know why that's been a thing for me recently. 1. Really? Okay. Normally that works. In this case, it has done a very bad job of actually going through, and like you can see, obviously these are not connected at all. So I'm going to try doing the same thing, but selecting the vertices, and now we have a decent distance threshold, which should attach these guys. So if we grab one of these, you can see that now it's not separating. So just take care, if you're mirroring stuff like that, make sure that all the vertices are attached back together along that seam line. Alright, so that is basically the main part of the back of this object. I'm going to scale that a little bit bigger just for fun. And again, I usually freeze transformations as I go just because I like being able to zero something out and just having it go back to where it should be. So if it's in a position that I want it to stay forever, I will zero those or freeze the transformation so I can, I don't need to like jimmy it back there manually. All right. So next bit, I'm going to do the main body for this piece. And I'm going to start with the overall shape of it. Then we're going to go and punch in these little holes here. And then we'll work on all the buttons and stuff like that later. So I'm going to start pretty much the exact same way I did before with a random cube. And I'm just going to, again, I would love if I had the reference in here, but Maya sucks, so here we are. So I'm going to make that in a shape that I think looks kind of accurate and just make it an arbitrary height for now. And again, I'm just going to zero that out because I know that if this is centered on the origin, if this object is, if I center this, it's going to be centered within the main object itself, which again is another reason I really like centering on the origin. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. Wow, that's very, very tall. And I'm going to go ahead and do pretty much the exact same thing where I go ahead and smooth the edge loops, smooth the edges here. So I will turn on symmetry for this object. And I think actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to add one loop on the width and one loop like this. Sometimes this helps with symmetry where like if you have that loop, it's easier to be like, this is half my object rather than having Maya having to like guess at like what the center point is. I don't know. For some reason this helps if you're using symmetry. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that in. And you can see even that helps to preserve the shape of the cube a little bit. But I'm going to go with my what is this tool? My multi-cut tool again. And just add in some edge loops here. So we can see that gives me a little bit rounder corners. Pop in some more loops there. And that's like kind of not terrible. It's a little bit weird because we have like this will be a more uniform edge if this is square than what I have originally made it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and kind of again make that sort of squarish or kind of and just kind of wing the bottom. So if I wanted to be like really spazzy about this, I could switch my symmetry so that like I had X symmetry when I was adding this loop and then Z when I was doing this, but I don't care that much frankly. It's kind of, that's like one of those things that's like a little overkill. Alright, so we have this, but in this case it's really like the edges are extremely squishy, so we just, we want to do that thing again where we just go in and we add a loop like really, really close to the bottom of this object. And then again, the top is also pretty hard, so if we just add another loop there, we can go ahead and just control delete that one, and once we smooth this, we do get something that looks, pretty close to whatever the back of this thing is. So that's basically that. You guys with me so far?
How did you get to the symmetry selection?
Oh.
You went a bit quick.
Yeah, it's so the symmetry tab is basically just like right up here. So by default, if you see a thing that's like symmetry off, you just toggle that on. So there are a few different versions of symmetry that you can use. So we have basically, let's see, so if I make a sphere over here, so the difference between object and world symmetry is basically object symmetry is looking at the center of this object. So if I grab, some faces with Z symmetry, object Z turned on, it's going to look at where's the pivot on this object, or where is the center point on this object, and it's going to try to mirror it from there. If we turn on world Z, that's going to behave basically along, instead of looking at the object, it's looking at the Z-axis itself. It's like where is it, like 0 on the Z-axis is where it chooses to split things. So that would be, if you have your object centered on the origin, they both behave exactly the same way for the most part. I almost never use world Z for anything because I find I'm usually just working on local objects. But yeah, so that was, I guess, quick bit on symmetry. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that does it.
Sweet. Anyone else have questions? All right. Cool. Moving right along. All right, so the next thing we need to do, and I just as another side note, I do find it when I'm doing modeling, when I'm doing smooth modeling, if I need to define an edge or like lay in an edge loop on a defining border, in this case like this little box thing, I do find that much, much, much easier to do in unsmooth mode. Because again, smooth mode is a little bit weird where like sometimes it looks like you're putting an edge loop in a specific spot, but then it like shifts around a little bit. So you want to make sure like wherever your main sort of like boundary edge loops are in unsmooth mode is going to be, once you harden those edges, that's where they're going to be in smooth mode. So just like a weird side note, again, you'll kind of, the more you work with stuff, the more you'll kind of like figure that out, but that's why I keep toggling back to unsmooth mode to like define where my boundaries are. Alright, so I'm going to go in again with my mesh, my multi-cut tool, and I still have symmetry turned on, so I'm just going to say like, alright, this looks kind of like where the edge loop should be here. I'm just going to go in and straight up delete those faces like a crazy person. And that'll be, I'm going to add them back in actually. Alright, so what I'm going to do is actually, there's a few different ways to do this, I guess, depending on how you've started modeling this. So what I'm going to do is actually add in another edge loop here. This thing is going to basically function as the depth, whatever the appropriate depth is for these little cutouts. So what I'm going to do is come in and grab these faces for these cutouts. I'm going to extrude them with a Control E, and then I'm going to use vertex snapping by holding V on my keyboard and just what now? Hello. Oh wait, I turned this to worlds. I don't know if that shouldn't make a difference, but I'm paranoid. Oh no, I know what I did. Alright, so I was trying to like move these down and I'm getting this crazy distortion face here. That's because I didn't delete. Okay, I've done a few bad things here, which is a common thing I see. So I'm going to show you how to fix it. But for one, I should have deleted this face here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. You'll notice though that after I've done that, it's really hard to see, but I have like, if we look inside the object, it'll be easier to see. We have this weird blue mysterious line thing here, which if we smooth the model, you'll see is actually just a face with no volume. So this is a thing that I actually saw a few times on like the UV assignment. So if you're ever trying to like stitch an edge together and you're like, it's not stitching, but it's clearly connected, try smoothing your model. There's probably some kind of weird either geometry error like this or like a vertex that's not connected, so it looks like it's attached, but it's not actually attached, and that's why you can't sew the UV seam. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Now the other thing you'll notice is that I didn't extrude, and I didn't move that extrude. So this is one of those things where, again, you can't really see it. Like, I still have, according to my poly count, I have 11 faces selected right now. But if we look at our model, you can't see them at all. However, if you smooth said model, they will very clearly show up, and that's why I like smooth mode for showing you mesh errors. So there's two ways that we can basically fix this. The easiest way is to actually just go and do an edit mesh merge. Since those vertices and faces are entirely on top of each other, it should very easily just merge them all together and basically get rid of those extra faces. The other alternative is to just delete the whole object. Haha, no. Delete those faces. This is another instance where, like, this is a common thing where now we don't have overlapping faces, but now if we, like, double-click on this, if you double-click on a face, it should select all the faces that are physically attached to it. But here you can see that it's not doing that. It's just grabbing this little patch. So they look connected, but they're not. So what we could do is either manually merge these together or just do the same thing I just did, which is an edit mesh merge. And that should go ahead and attach them together. So weird bit on model fixing, I guess. All right. So any questions on that? All right. Cool. So what I'm going to do is what I was trying to do before, which is grab these faces and just go ahead and extrude those down with a Control E. I'm just going to line them up with this little edge here. And you can use vert snapping if you want to get really precise about that, which is, again, pressing and holding V on the keyboard. And I find it helpful to just put your mouse over, or put your cursor like over the thing you actually want. And I'm going to hit G to repeat my last command, which is extrude, and then just use vertex snapping again to mush those down into the side here. Now this is also currently a very broken mesh, so there's a few issues with this. One, Technically, we still have a ginormous hole in the mesh here because I've not added these edge loops. They're like, there's no faces there. They look like they're there, and this actually is like a weird. I'm gonna delete history on this object just for fun, which is Alt-Shift-D. If you guys are looking for hotkeys, I'm gonna make this a little bit less dark because it'll be easier to see what the back of an object, back of the face is. So we look at this here, and it's like, okay, this is very obviously the back of a face. This is also an example of a face with no volume to it, so that's bad for like a number of reasons. Also, it's, again, not attached to the main model. So what I want to do is just grab these two faces here. Grab these two dudes. Shamelessly delete them! Wahaha! And you'll see actually that now when you do that, the model looks much more correct and much closer to this object. The downside, again, if you smooth this, it's broken still. So the thing that I look for if I'm looking for broken geometry with the smooth model is, you'll see here how all the loops are sort of nice and they have like a very sort of fluid, bendy flow, whereas here they're like, no. It makes this really like, it's just like pointing at the issue basically. But instead of having like a nice smooth flow like this area does, it's just like a point. So if you ever see that, it usually means there's a vertex not connected. If we grab these guys and do a merge to center, you'll see that how this loop here is laying is also changed, and it's also smoothed. And that's how you know you're sort of going in the right direction and like that was actually causing an issue. So I'm just going to go through, and I find this kind of cathartic, so I'm just going to do it manually. So I just go ahead and merge them all together. And apart from the fact that for some reason it seems like I've broken symmetry on my object, and that did not fix itself over here, I'm going to, actually, you know what? Or you could do an edit mesh merge, and it will just merge them all since you use vertex snapping, they should be in the same spot. Alright, so that's pretty much that. So again, every once in a while I just delete history because I like deleting history. Basically what that does is it'll just like remove extra data from like, you know, Maya will save basically every time you do an extrude or like a poly tweak or like a append to polygon. Maya saves all that data, and sometimes it can break the model. So it's usually a good idea just as you go or like at the end of a model to delete history on it. So you can also just do, if you don't like the hotkeys, it's edit, delete by type, and history. But yeah, so good idea to do that. I just sort of do it reflexively at this point. Alright, so we have the basic shape. Anybody have any questions about any of this, or any of that like weird model fix tangent before we go on? Alright. Where is the merge to center tool? So I believe it's mesh, edit mesh, merge to center, or there's this weird little like pizza thing that I keep clicking on. So that's the two places I usually grab that. Alright. Any other questions? Yep, no worries. Alright. Excellent. So, one thing also, so I've decided that I should have actually probably made these, oh wow, the proportions of this are just clearly off. I'm actually just going to grab this whole object and scale it bigger. Because I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is pretty much square, and these are objectively wider, and that seems to have largely done kind of what I wanted. So there's a few different schools of thought on how to, or like when to add those smoothing edge loops to things. So in this case, I mean, I did the corners because I figure like that was kind of like an important shape to like know where they were supposed to be. But I could do basically one of two things with this, where I could block in all of the geometry down here with in unsmooth mode and then just go back and smooth everything at once, or I could add a feature and smooth it, go and just sort of keep going like that. It doesn't really make a difference which way you do. I think today I'm kind of feeling like doing the add a feature and smooth it. So what I'm going to do is, again, just go through. So basically, it seems like all of these are pretty hard lines, so I just want this to be very like boxy. So what I'm going to do is just pop in with the multi-cut tool, as one does. And again, just sort of, hello. Hello. Please don't crash. I'm gonna save this really quick in case Maya explodes, as it does. Newer light version 1. Cool, because I don't like having to redo stuff. Alright. So I'm going to pop in, again, with my multi-cut tool, and if we want this little edge down here to be hard, we need an edge on side 1 and another edge on side 2. So that that should be pretty good. Go ahead and do the same thing on this side. And basically just, again, anywhere that you don't have those loops, you need to add them in. So it's kind of, would you work the way you're supposed to, please? Are you guys having any issues with lag or anything like that?
I'm not having any.
Okay. Well, I mean, now my computer is just actually being terrible. Sometimes multi-cut tool like doesn't exit out of the tool properly. It's extremely annoying. So I'm going to try switching over my insert edge loop tool because that actually seems to be working for once. That is never the tool that just works for me. And I think what I'm going to do, instead of adding a bunch of extra loops for no particular reason, so this is the one I just sort of added in randomly to just like have a loop in the middle. I'm actually just going to take that whole thing and just slide it the heck down. And then go into G for multi-cut again, and pop in another loop on that side. So that should give us something kind of decent. You'll see that there's a few issues with this. One, I've clearly forgotten a loop here because that is way squishier than it should be, and we get what I call, again, some like pulling down here, where if you, this is what blends make much more obvious than like a Lambert, but you'll see that there's like that weird little ridge there, which means probably that I've also forgotten an edge loop somewhere. So if I come in and, where am I going? The one time I turn this on. Alright, so basically what's happening here is a lot of times you will get that weird sort of pulling if you forgot a loop. And I did forget a loop. So on this particular edge, this dude here, I have this loop here, but I'm missing one here. So I just need to go in and add another loop. And that should fix the pulling issue there. If I turn off this god-awful wireframe, you can see again, that's now like nice and hard and, you know, pretty much without issue. But we still have this weird thing on this other side where, again, being the dingus that I am, I have forgotten a loop. And this is the worst part about smooth modeling. It's just like, you just need to add a bunch of random loops, and like you always forget one. It's like you just have to go back and like keep adding them. It's very funny. Hello. Alright, so again, we have this edge here where I have a loop on one side and I'm just missing it on the other. So I'm going to go in with my insert edge loop tool again and just be like, bleh. Excellent. Now we have nice harder edges. So that's basically the most of what you need for making that shape. The only other few things to be aware of is a few things. So one, obviously I've forgotten more loops here because this looks catastrophically terrible and is not supposed to be squishy like that. Also, the insert edge tool is apparently still active and just randomly adding things into my mesh. Which is the one thing I don't like about the insert edge tool. Also, I think mine might have frozen. Give it a second. Or it's crashing. One of the 7. Yep, there we go. You gotta love it. Alrighty then. The good thing about if Maya pulls up that fatal error, that means it's usually been able to actually successfully save some kind of file that you can recover. So that's fun. Yeah, it's trying to write this little save file. So I usually give it a minute and then it'll close itself and then I'll just reopen it. But this is a great point to stop and fill some time talking about different ways Maya can crash. So I find that the insert edge loop tool is one of the main things that will often crash Maya for me, so that's one of the reasons that I use multi-cut tool now. Again, like I said, that weird little save, or like that fatal error thing, usually means it'll pull a save file for you. So I'm actually gonna force kill Maya. God, what do I even have open on here? Okay, or it'll kill itself, that's fine. Blah, blah, blah. Cool, pull it back up. So I should have a save file. If Maya just quits without any error messages, usually, in my experience, there's not been a whole lot I can do to recover my files. So it is always very good practice as you are doing things to save multiple versions of a file. So like I saved this as like Neweer Light version 1. If I am about to make a significant change, or if I've just been like working for an hour or two, I'll save a Neweer Light version 2 file. So that way, if I ever have an issue where like my file gets corrupted, or I just do something catastrophically stupid to my file and like save it by accident, you know, I've only lost an hour of work compared to, oh crap, I only had all of my stuff in a single file, and now it's gone forever. So versioning is good. You can also make, one thing I do a lot is like make little versions or duplicates of the object as I work in the same file. And then every once in a while I'll go through and delete them because it gets to be like a lot. But yeah. Okay, so what's the actual difference between the insert edge loop tool and the multi-cut tool? Like, why would the edge loop tool be more prone to crashes? In terms of, oh, yes, look, we have saved files, theoretically. So this is that little thing that it tried to save that should be the most up-to-date file. But yeah, so in terms of being prone to crashes, I have absolutely no idea why it causes that. But for some reason, it's just like one of those things that I have issues with. The difference between the multi-cut tool and the insert edge loop tool is multi-cut can do everything the insert edge loop tool can and more. So it's kind of like I've just switched to multi-cut tool because it allows me to like doodle on my mesh, and sort of like switch back and forth between two tools that like I otherwise like wouldn't super be able to do, if that makes sense. Or like it's more tools in one basically, but they will function exactly the same as the insert edge loop tool. So I'm going to save. Usually if Maya crashes, I save a new version of my file. Also, if your file crashes, never overwrite a file that you know works. Like I had a Neweer Lite version 1. Don't override that because every once in a while, crash will like corrupt your file, and if you override another file, you've then lost your data. Things I know from experience. But did that answer your question with the insert edge loop tool versus multi-cut? Sweet. There's also another tool which is super fun, which is the offset edge loop tool. And that is... where am I going? Mesh tools, offset edge loop. What that does is it will basically add a loop. If you click on an edge, it'll add loops equidistant on either side of the edge. So if you're trying to make like a very specific, like, proportioned line or something like that, it's a really convenient tool to use for that. I actually have a video somewhere going over the difference between the three, but yeah. Ow! I just kicked my ankle into the chair, and that was bad. That was a bad time. All right. So here's a fun thing so like, let's see if this works now. I have no faith in this. So basically what we need to do is, again, this whole area is like super squishy. So I need an edge loop on this side, and that's fine, right? That makes it a little bit harder. And then I need an edge loop over here. So that's fine. Like now this little nub here is delightful, and I've also turned symmetry off like a dingus. So I'm going to turn that back on. But yeah, so now we have this nice hard loop here. But in adding that one loop here, we've now hardened the edges. So now this is the wrong shape. And this is where smooth modeling gets a little bit weird. So there's a few different ways to fix that. So basically, the option that I'm going to take here is I'm going to delete that edge loop that I just added, but I still can't leave this like squishy because that is gross. There's also a little bit of pulling in this edge, which is a thing that I will find. So what I'm going to do instead is I basically, like, I need this to stay where it is. But what I can do is grab this. Like, if I grab everything except the edge, I can shift this freely in here. So you'll notice that, like, whatever I'm doing on the inside of this object isn't really affecting the profile of this. But basically, if I squish this all the way up here, like a maniac, it does a kind of, sort of, not terrible job. It does get a little bit of distortion up here, but it will harden this edge and leave this, for the most part, unchanged. So we are getting a little bit of issues in this case where, like I said, this edge is being like hardened unevenly, which you can kind of see where it's like being like weirdly mashed in there. So what you can do, in this case, we can sort of like redraw this a little bit, so it's a little bit diagonal. And this is something that I'll use multi-cut tool for, which is basically, I'll just go in, click on a point, and come on. and click on another point, and it will draw a line straight between them. You can also define additional points in there if you need to, if you know, straight line's not what you're going for. And then what you can do is just grab that original loop piece and just Control Delete that, and then you have something that's like a little bit better. So that's basically the sort of this top part of that. Does anybody have any questions on that part? So Control Delete will delete the vertices. If we have a random sphere. So this is another thing I saw. I think I went over this, but it's like a weird thing. So basically, I'm just going to delete this. Not Control Delete, just regular delete. And you'll see that, I mean, there's still like very clearly like vertices chilling here in the middle of an edge. This is still registering as like two separate edges. Whereas if you grab and you do a Control Delete, you can see that change the profile. This edge is now a single edge, and there's no vertices chilling in here. So if you ever do get this and you just like forget to do Control Delete, what you can do is marquee select of your whole object in vertex mode and just hit delete. Any of those weird floating vertices it'll get rid of. The only thing to be aware of when you're doing that is if you have like a plane and you do that, it's going to basically pick an edge basically and delete it. So if your vertices basically aren't attached to something on all four corners, it's gonna, like I said, just pick one and delete. Like if you have, what am I saying? If you have a random quad extending out of a piece of your geometry and you do this, it will make that quad a trie. So I mean, you can fix that. It's just like a weird thing to be aware of, and probably not super relevant to you guys, but just again, things to be aware of. Alright, so let's go in and shrink my screen back so I can work with my poorly set up orthographic view, cough cough. Alright, so let's punch in some buttons, I guess. And this is a thing that will be directly relevant to you guys doing buttons for your finals, or this object for the light. So for this, this is a good object to practice on if for the final if you're trying to do, again, something with buttons, because there's just like a crap ton of holes in this. Like the overall shapes are pretty simple, but there's a lot of buttons. So this is a good object to practice buttons on. So like, also probably good practice for like a Switch controller for the final. The shapes are pretty similar. But the button bit works pretty generically depending on what you're trying to do. So in this case, we have this little sort of power hole thingy over here. I'll come back to that. I think I'm going to start with the square switch because it's going to be the easiest one to add in. So what I'm going to do is add in some more loops, and I should probably turn off symmetry for this because that is not on both sides of the object. So what I'm going to do is just punch in some loops again, just where I want stuff. I'm doing this in unsmooth mode, and just say like, alright, this is kind of where I want my button. Yay. Now, you'll notice that when I did that, again, I need to go in basically, like if I don't want to mess with this corner, I can't put a whole lot of stuff in here, in that specific area. So what I'm going to do is just take these, take this area basically where I'm sort of deciding this button looks kind of appropriate, and I'm just going to kind of slide that down into place. So I don't recommend, where possible, if you can avoid having like wiggly geometry like this, makes things a little easier to look at. On flat surfaces like the back of this thing, it's not a huge issue. So what I'm going to do is just kind of extrude this, and I'll just scale this in, because you can see that button is sitting in a little, it's like sitting in like a little blob kind of thing. That was really specific. There's a little extra perimeter around it. So what I'm going to do is basically this extrude is blocking out where that little perimeter thing is going to be. And then I'm going to extrude again and just push that down. So this is going to be the hole for my button. I'm going to make the button separately. I'm not going to try to put that in the same object. Again, just because that way, if you were ever to go through and like animate this or whatever, you could flip this button back and forth. Like you could physically rotate that object separately. Same thing for any of these like little control dials, anything like that. So having those objects separate makes it, you know, easier to animate if you needed to in the future, or if you were, if you ever see those like product photography videos where they like explode an object, obviously you can't explode it if it's all a single object. So anyway, Alright, so we have our delightful looking little buttonhole. What I'm gonna do is, it looks like that's a tiny bit raised. I can't really tell, but I'm just gonna grab that edge loop there and just extrude that up a tiny bit. So this obviously looks really bad right now. It's very squishy. Again, a lot of doing the hard edge or the smooth modeling is just going back and adding edge loops very systematically. So I'm going to save this because paranoia. And I'm going to... What the heck is this loop even for? This is doing nothing. Oh yeah, this is where I randomly clicked on my object and put a loop in. Oh, and then it crashed Maya. Wow, it saved that loop. How considerate of it. So I'm just going to cheat and just kind of like drag that over since it's already kind of where I need it. And then I'll just multi-cut into the other side to harden those edges. So again, just like any corner basically needs 3 edges to be hardened. So I've done, like, we have now nice edges around the outside. The inside's still a little bit squishy, and that is because I need a loop at the bottom here. I've put one at the top, and I should, so this is another one of those things where just figuring out where to add all the edge loops is kind of a pain. So we have this loop here, and again, loop, 1 edge, that's fine. We need another loop going around here. And I actually have a molding video, which is like the edge flow with the insert edge loop tool, I think, which is very relevant for these buttons, also for doing anything like molding, cabinet molding. So again, I do recommend watching that one in the weekly videos. But yeah, so now I have this nice little button. You will also notice, though, that it's still pretty gosh darn squishy around the edges, which I'm not a huge fan of. There's a few things we can do to fix that. One is add another edge loop around this part. That's going to harden the top a little bit. It's not going to do a whole lot for the sides. So what we need to do is basically, again, just add a bunch more loops, and eventually this will be not squishy looking. Squishy, of course, being the technical term for this. So in this case, again, you'll see that it's doing a much better job now. One thing just to be aware of, and this is more relevant actually for when you're splitting stuff around, splitting stuff for like UVing and texturing. So if we look at this in unsmooth mode, I've basically grabbed this last, like this is still part of that little raised area, but if we smooth this, you'll see it's being smashed and like dragged across the front of the object. So if you were to split the UV seam there and texture this, you would get a bunch of like really disgusting, like a really crappy edge basically around this. So that's the thing to be aware of, again, because I'm missing some loops. We have the we have this main loop defining like where the raised area should start. We have an edge loop here. We're missing one on the side. So a lot of this is genuinely just, you just gotta keep adding a bunch of loops. It's very systematic. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like this is the most fun thing ever, but I'm just gonna go in and add a loop again on pretty much every outer boundary of this button area. And if that does anything weird with the sides, I'll clean that up later. Arg. When multi-cut goes wrong, what are you doing? Oop. Cool. Hopefully by next week, if I can get my computer working, that's a rendering week, so hopefully I'll be able to actually render and do demos. Alright, so now we have this delightful little buttonhole here. It's all the edges are nice and it's all prepped and ready for when we want to add a button in. So let's, just for grins, because I have it here, mwahaha, let's go in and add that button in. So I'm going to be really lazy about this, and I am just going to start from a plane, draw this in to be the appropriate shape of whatever I'm looking for, and this is like one of those weird little curved buttons. And this is where I absolutely adore smooth modeling. It's for dumb stuff like curved buttons, which sounds really stupid, but it's true. It's super nice for this. So, alright, so here's our thing. Basically, I'm going to hit 3. You can't really tell if this is smoothed, but what I'm going to do is drag this middle point down. Now, it's very obvious if it's smoothed or not smoothed. And you can see it makes this very delightful little sort of bend here. So with these 3 loops, we get a very, very nice smooth curve in this little button. And depending on how you arrange those, you get different types of curves. But we have this super nice curve, which would have been really annoying with a bevel tool, or trying to start from a cylinder and then like modeling that in. It's just like super nice. So all I'm gonna do is maybe put this you know, kind of vaguely in position. And I'm just going to go ahead and extrude that entire object and move the faces all the way down and just scale them flat. Frankly, I'm sure that that's not an accurate representation of what that button looks like if I were to rip it out of the model, but it is close enough. I have no idea what it looks like behind that, so all that really matters is surface detail for this. So what I'm going to do is mesh display reverse this, because you'll notice it was black, it was basically inside out. And then again, we got to do the thing where we add a bunch of extra edge loops into this. So I'm just going to systematically go through, and like all the edges on this are pretty hard, with the exception of those little, like these little nubbies in the middle. So I'm going to go through and just pop in a bunch of edge loops here, and I think I got all of them. Yeah, cool. So we have a very, very nice button here. If you wanted to, like the curvature of this looks a little weird to me, so I could just, dang it, grab all those vertices and you just kind of pull them down a little bit. And it's like really, really easy to reshape this, which is one of the reasons I really like smooth modeling. The thing to be aware of, so I mentioned on the assignment doc that more loops is not always a good thing. And that's so if I was like trying to reshape this object and I had like loops here and here and here, it actually, for smooth modeling, will actually make it harder to reshape this because I have to manually drag these around. So in this case, like having those 3 edge loops in the middle instead of like 7 is like kind of a nice sweet spot. But again, it depends a lot on what you're making. So, delightful button. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, a perfectly viable way to model a button, is basically just have a little cube sitting in a little sort of gasket for it. This is, again, pretty much what I'm looking for if you guys are doing anything with like buttons, remotes, phones, switch controls, anything like this. Do the buttons separate to make a little hole for them. That's all I'm looking for. All right. Yay, buttons. Anyone have any questions on that? Alrighty then. Cool, cool. So, let us go forth, and I'm going to turn symmetry back on. We're going to add these little circly buttons here. And then pretty much all the other buttons, like once you've done these circle buttons, all of the other circles you do pretty much the exact same way. So this is not necessarily an object where you're doing a lot of different things, but it is very good for practicing adding buttons over and 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 over again. And over again. But yeah. So I think I've demoed this before. So for buttons, the way that I usually like to make them is, again, don't Boolean them out. Oh, ooh, let me give you a Boolean demonstration on a smoothed object, because it's really bad. I have one supplemental video this week that's like one example of when Booleans aren't totally terrible. This particular thing I'm about to do, Booleans are still terrible for it. I just want to show you what it looks like. Alright, so I'm going to grab this and do a mesh Booleans difference. And I'm going to go ahead and smooth that, and look how terrible that looks. Smoothing Booleans is, or Booleaning anything that you're smoothing, don't ever do it. You can kind of get away with it on unsmooth models, which, honestly, models for 3D printing, which is mostly what I do, are unsmooth models. So at the end, I will build stuff in separate pieces and just Boolean the crap out of everything at the very end of what I'm doing. Never Boolean your smooth modeling stuff. It 99.999% of the time is terrible. It makes your edge flow awful. Like, edge flow on smooth modeling is kind of important because, like, now, you know, if I want to add an edge loop in this, I can't because there's a bajillion n-gons in here. But yeah, so don't Boolean stuff. It's really gross. There's not a hugely great way to go back and actually like fix any of this. If you do, the one thing I sort of like mentioned is like doing a mesh cleanup, which still smooths terribly, and again, really botches up anything if you're trying to like select, you know, a whole loop of stuff through your object. Don't Boolean stuff. Booleaning is bad. So the nicer way to, okay. The nicer way to make an edge loop, or this like holes for these buttons, is, again, to kind of go through, so what I usually do is basically make a square around where my object is, if that makes any sense at all. So if I had that button, basically just make like a little bounding box square, like if I were to trace an edge loop straight down here, straight down here, straight down this way, and then straight down this way. And that's will get you actually pretty close to what you might want for a square button. So in this case, like I said, I have these edge loops just floating around here, not really doing anything. I'm just going to harvest them and drag them down to where I need them. This is another one of those instances where having this spike here is not going to hurt anything. It just looks weird and it's kind of gross. So I'm also just going to move that down into place, and then like this one, make sure I'm not selecting anything. Make sure I'm not selecting anything on the back of my object. Again, not going to hurt anything. It just looks really gross, and if you do this, it just is much clearer what's going on, and it's kind of much more manageable. All right, so here we have this, and you know, it's a thing. I think I'm actually, before I go super crazy farther into this, I'm actually going to go into a little bit about terminating edge loops, which is, there's a lot of that with like the practice video today. So on this object, it's actually not hugely important for the most part. You could get away without doing any of this, but it's just kind of gross to look at in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is basically, my goal is, instead of having 3 loops coming off of every edge, to basically narrow some of these down where I don't need them, just so there's fewer loops to have to deal with. So like I said, largely optional for this object, but what I'm going to do here is grab this little clump of vertices. I'm going to go ahead and just merge these dudes to center. I'm going to do the same thing down here. I just G to repeat the last command. And then I'm going to click on this and click on this. In this case, since, did I have symmetry on when I did this? No, I didn't have symmetry on. Okay, that's fine. Actually, that is, yeah, that's fine. But you'll see it's just selecting these loops on the top, and then I can just control delete those. And now it's just like a little bit more manageable again, where like instead of having to deal with, instead of having to deal with those 3 loops, why am I incapable of clicking buttons right now? What is, oh, wait, is this a symmetry issue? What are you doing? I think this is symmetry yelling at me right now. Yeah, cool. It's just, again, in my opinion, entirely optional, but like a little bit neater to look at in this instance, where rather than having to deal with like 12 edge loops mashed around in here, we just have this nice row of 4. And you can do that, like doing that on pretty much any smooth object. You can do that more or less wherever. If we smooth that, again, it makes pretty much no effect at all on the surface. Alright, so next thing I'm going to do, so we have our lovely box around our theoretical button, is I'm going to punch in a loop in the middle vertically, and a loop in the middle horizontally. And now, we have the basis for our button! Wahaha! I don't know why I'm so hyper about buttons right now. It's like a little bit weird. But anyway. And, of course, I turned on the wrong symmetry. That's okay. This is an instance where I'd probably end up splicing my model together at the end, but I'm not really going to pay attention to that right now. Alright. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is basically just grab this. I'm going to extrude this inwards a little bit so that I have a flat little thing, ring of faces in here. And I'm going to use the circularize tool every single time. That was merged to center. I'm going to use the circularize tool, which is like 5 tools to the right. And that's going to make me a nice, perfect circle so that when you smooth it like this, it's going to look wrong, and that's fine. But once we put in some more edge loops, it's going to look, you know, actually correct. Just make sure that this is the right size for your circle. You might need to shift some of these little dudes up, and this is, again, totally fine. But once you grab this, again, you should be able to just add that little hole for your button, and we have a nice, delightful buttonhole. You'll see that once you extrude that down, it does a much better job smoothing. And what we can do to finish this off, because again, we don't want this to be mushy, we want this nice hard edge here, is go ahead and extrude that again, scale these little faces in, and then we just need to add some more loops over here. And basically the same principle as sort of what I was doing previously, but now we have a delightful circular buttonhole. The circularize tool is new, and frankly, I love it so much. It's delightful. So a few things to be aware of. I'm actually, since symmetry wasn't working, I'll demo this on the other side. Wahaha. There's a few things to be aware of with this. So if you're going to do this, technically, if you extrude a perfect quad downwards, it will give you a circle, but it's not going to be a nice circle. So you should have, if you're going to do this, at a minimum, 6 edge loops running around the outside of your circle. 8 is preferable. And if you have, you know, 10 or 12 or whatever, however many more, that's fine. But usually 8 is like the minimum kind of ideal that I want to go to. It makes it easier to edit. You don't have a huge amount of extra loops coming out everywhere. But again, 6 is sort of the minimum that I would do to avoid having like weird distortion. But yeah, so anybody have any questions about this particular button? All right, moving right along. So one thing you can do, while just adding this other button here. So again, everything on your object should be set up to do smooth modeling nicely. One thing I do is if I'm doing smooth modeling, you do not need 20 divisions on your axis. It's like hardcore overkill. So in this case, maybe I'll go up to like 12. Kind of looks circly as I'm doing stuff, and you just like leave that hanging out there. That's fine. But again, you do need to make sure that this object smooths, even though you can just technically, yes, you could just make a cylinder with like 100 subdivisions, but don't do that. It's really gross. So what I'm going to do is just grab the top and bottom faces of this, extrude them, and then scale them ever so slightly in. That's going to give me the loops on the top of this object, and then I'm going to grab the side here, extrude, and just scale that down. And that very, very easily gives you a nice cylinder that smooths, which looks way better than something with 1,000 edge loops on the side. So like I said, I mean, that's pretty much what I'm looking for. So like when I say every object is smooth, I mean like I will be literally marquee selecting over everything in your scene, hitting the 3 key, and grading while that's done. But anywho, so that's that knob. Clearly the wrong size, but whatever. Any questions on that? All right, cool. So I do really quickly just want to show you guys what happens. There is like an alternate way to set up the geometry for this button that I prefer. If I'm doing circular buttons, I prefer to set it up like this, and I'll sort of show you why in a second. So basically, you'll remember that I did that weird little like extrude right before I circularized the loops in there. So if I don't do that, like if I just go straight to, I hit the right button this time. If I just go straight to circularize, and then I do the same thing, where in this case I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna go ahead, extrude, and push this down a little bit, and I'm just gonna add my loops as I go, because I know I need to. Grr, what are you doing? Cool, loops. Extrude that down, and I'm just pressing G very, very aggressively to repeat the last command. Alright, so now we have this nice, mostly smooth hole. But we do, again, we're getting that weird stretching where like this clearly should be inside the little hole, but it's being mushed onto the outside. If you don't have that extrude in here, and this was a little aggressive of an extrude, honestly. I didn't need that much of it, but if you don't have that extrude, what you need to do to harden this edges is basically go through and do the thing where you add a loop, and a loop, and a loop, and a loop, which is just really annoying and kind of excessive, honestly, for what you need, where it will get you the result you want, but it also shoots so many more loops. Like it has like this, and this. You'll notice like this button does not have those, and it doesn't need them to make the hard edges. So it's just like one of those things where like doing it this way with that little extra extrude on the top, it'll help the rest of your model stay cleaner while you're hardening things, so you don't have to deal with like a billion extra loops on things. So I'm going to delete that because it's terrible and I hate it. But does that make sense, sort of? I do have like other videos going over that as well. But are there any questions on that? Alright, cool. Alright, so moving right along, I think that's, honestly, the rest of this back piece is pretty much the same as doing, it's literally just adding more buttons into stuff, basically. Or adding other little back panels. So like, hello, that's not the right object. There we go. I'm just gonna stop trying to fight with this. So like you look at, this is pretty much the same basic shape, like this little indent thing here. You can ignore the plastic film, by the way. I'm just weird. I have monitors from 7 years ago that still have plastic film on them. But I never take it off. But this shape is basically the same thing as like this outer area here, or like this thing. Just like silhouette-wise with like the rounded corners, and then you make it the same way as a button, where you just set up the original shape that you like, get the profile of the corners, and then take all of the little pieces and just smush them down a little bit with an extrude. So again, I mean, pretty much all of this is like more or less the same sort of basic principle for things. And this object, again, is probably kind of annoying. Like, the overall shapes are fairly simple. Um, it's just that there's a lot of them. Like, that's what makes this hard, is like the sheer repetition of doing this. So just be aware of that for this particular model. The thing that I did want to touch on is the face of this. And actually, you know what? I think if you want to leave the flaps on, I have them in like a billion different positions. If you want to leave them on, you're welcome to. If you want to leave the flaps off, that's fine. The thing that I wanted to touch on is, like I said, make sure that you model every single one of these little UVs in, and there's a nice trick to do that. It's not going to take nearly as long as you think. So, like I said, these are physically separate objects, so as far as I'm concerned, they can be separate objects in your final piece. I also don't care. With these little holes, you do not need to model them in. That's actually one of the few times, if you do want to model that in, watch in the playlist for the week. Where is it? There's that playlist, When Booleans Aren't Evil. If you do want to model those holes in that grate, watch this video. Because that will do it for you very, very easily. That's the only time I recommend Booleans. Alright, so anyway. LED lights. So I'm just going to randomly wander in and make an LED light on some part of this object. And actually it looks like the bottom was a little bit of a harder edge, so I'm just going to kind of grab this dude and drag it. Hello. That's good. That's nice. Oh, right. I moved. Oh, wait, yeah, no, I moved that up manually. Whatever. I'm going to leave it for now. Doesn't really matter. So I think what I'm going to do, probably the easiest way to model one of these stupid little LEDs is to just start with a random sphere. 12 edges is all you need for this. And I'm just going to isolate select that and go ahead, delete the bottom part of that entirely. Grab this little thing here, this little edge, just extrude that down. And it looked like they had a little sort of like lip thing at the bottom. Do make sure if you're going to scale something, you have symmetry turned off. It'll do really weird stuff to your model. And then you can just sort of refresh your tool, basically toggle to another one and then go back, and it should put you back in the center where you should be. So I'm going to go ahead and just extrude in that little... extrude. I'm adding the edges as I go because I know where they need to be. If you have trouble doing that, don't worry about it. You can just sort of add stuff in retrospect, and that's totally fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this basically like a finished object. I do want this to be a solid piece of geometry. It did also seem like there was some kind of weird little like bump thing in the middle of this, which I assume was probably like whatever little light fuse thing was like in here giving this light. So I'm going to add that as I go, and basically we have this weird looking little LED thing. The thing that I would like to stress very quickly is I highly recommend you UV this one object before going forward, otherwise you're going to have to copy the UVs to like 100 different light bulbs. You can do it, it's not the end of the world, it's just really annoying. Alright, so we have this light thing, and this not having this loop here will drive me crazy. Okay. I give up. For some reason, multi-cut is just adding vertices to my stuff randomly now. So anyway. So we have this little light bulb, and what you want to do if you're actually doing this assignment for realsies is I included enough images so that you can literally count how many light bulbs there are in this thing. But what you do, basically, to make these is, first of all, I would probably line up where you want the first one to be. Just say, like, down here. Cool. Lovely. And that's kind of, like, hanging out over there, and move that up into place a little bit. Cool. Alright, so we have this. What I'm going to do is freeze transformations on this. And I am going to duplicate this object, and then, if I was working from reference, I would just line this up where the next bulb in the thing is, and say, alright, to get there, I needed to move this over -2.753. Copy that value. I'm also going to delete this little dude. And what you can do is go into Edit, Duplicate Special, open your settings for this, and then what you can do is, anyone remember what axis I moved that on? It looked like Z. So basically, copy in whatever values you had from this. So if you had like negative 2.1 whatever on the Z, paste that value in here, leave everything else as 0, and hit apply. And you can do that repeatedly, and you can, if you want to, do 20 copies of this, and it will auto-populate these lights for you. Equidistantly spaced. It's super amazing and super easy. So that is my uber hack for making repeating geometry like this. There's two other things that you should be aware of when using this tool. So one is the geometry type. Copy is the same thing as doing like a Control D or like a copy and paste, where if you modify one of them, it will not modify the other. So let me actually do that really quick. I'll just shift this randomly 10 units to the right and make one copy because I'm not a crazy person. Alright, so this is a copy. These guys are instances. What an instance is, and this can be really helpful depending on what you're doing, is if you modify one of these objects, it will modify every single object that's an instance. Like you can see it doing that down to all of the objects. So this is what I will usually do. Like if I, this way, if I'm like, ah, crap, I need to modify the UVs, or like, oh, I need to, tweak this, like the shape was a little bit wrong, it will tweak all of them at once. Do be aware that that does run a particular risk of every once in a while it can like mess up your computer. This is a semi-high poly object. It has 206 polys, and by the time you make, 100 of these, it can be a lot of polys. So just be aware of that if you're going to set stuff to instances. You could also use less geometry in your original sphere. That would be also totally viable. But what you can do, and again, you'll notice that, like if I extrude a face or whatever out of this, it's not doing that to the instance version, it is changing the instances, but the copies are just copies. So if you also decide that you want these to no longer be instances, which a lot of times, like if you're trying to, if you want something to just be slightly different, you would want it to not be an instance. Or if you're trying to export your mesh, sometimes having it be an instance will cause issues. What you can do is just select your object and go to Modify, Convert. It's like Instance to Polygon or something like that. Instance to Object. So that way, if we grab a face on this dude, you'll see this one that I converted is no longer being modified. So just be aware of that. That's not a step that I'll be looking for specifically for this assignment. It's just, things to be aware of if you're like, oh crap, I don't want this to be an instance anymore. Does anybody have any questions on this? Alright, cool. Yeah, the UVs should carry over. So like if we look at least last time I did them, they did. So we have these hideous UVs. If I UV that, you can see that it like highlighted all the other objects. So now if we look at them, they all have, the UVs should carry over. So that's the thing where if you copy them and you didn't UV it, that is a handy way of doing it. I do have a video, I think from last week, about copying and pasting UVs if you, mess up and you need to like manually copy them over. That's one thing I really do like about instances. It's very convenient sometimes. Fun tidbit, do not instance your lights. If it renders, it usually renders significantly slower and it can cause other weird issues. Fun things I learned when it took me 8 hours to render my CGI 1 final for a single frame. Haha, don't instance your lights. Okay. The other thing you can do for this, for these lights, is like, obviously it's not one strip of lights, and if you don't want to click a bunch of buttons 80 times, what you can do is select all the lights for a particular row, group them together with Control G, and then, here's where it gets really weird, you can edit, duplicate, special, that. So what I'm going to do is, instead of translating this on the Z now, I don't want these to move over, I just want these to be copied down in perpetuity. So I'm just going to grab this, paste that in there, apply, 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 20, not 30 times, dear God, 20 times. And now we have a giant panel. Okay, I might have gone a little bit ham with the lights because now these are everywhere, but now you have lights. And then for the end, you can just be like, oops, I made 4 extra groups. Oops, get rid of them. Cool, now you have lights. So that's what I would do for the lights. It's a fairly straightforward way to set them up, I think. And then I do at some point, you probably do want to uninstance these, but for, like I said, for this week, totally fine to leave them instanced. But it's a really convenient way to do things. I do stuff like this all the time. Mostly for, like, I'll use it for laying out my build plate in my 3D printer really efficiently. If I need to print 500 of a tiny object, I will totally lay them out like this. So it is, duplicate special is a delightful, weird little trick for things. But yeah, so I think functionally that's probably most of what you need to do this assignment. The only other thing that I sort of wanted to go over, I guess before we do that, does anyone have any questions on any of that? All right. Really quick, I want to go over how to make these little knobby bits, because I feel like I know tricks that will make it much easier, basically, is what I'm going for there. And I'm not even going to model these on the object. I'm just going to kind of randomly model these somewhere else in the scene, just so you get the idea of like how to, a convenient way to make them. So I'm not expecting you to count the little nubs on the outside, because that's stupid and dumb. But I'm just going to say there's probably 30 little like ridges on the outside, and you can model these in extremely easily. If you grab these faces on the edge, you do Control E for extrude, turn keep faces together off. If you don't get this little pop-up, you should also be able in your channel box here under poly extrude to figure out somewhere that setting here. Yeah, keep faces together, and you turn it off there as well. But what this will do is if you pull stuff out along the z-axis, it'll give you these. Each face will be treated basically like its own object. So I mean, this looks insane right now, but if you smooth it, you can see that you do get a little bit of those like nice defined ridges that we had from the object itself. And then to smooth this is actually way less catastrophically annoying than it looks, where basically you just grab all the faces on the side, you do a Control E, and you scale those down. And that will give you something pretty close to that object. We do need to do a little bit of work, because like obviously this is missing the screw cap, and there's also a whole lot of pulling on the top. So I'll do the screw cap really quick, because I found a convenient way to do that like a year or so ago that was like actually worked pretty well. I'm going to delete all the faces on the top of this thing, and then what I'm going to do is grab, say, where am I going? I'm actually going to turn on symmetry for this. Might make my life a little bit easier. All right, maybe. Cool. So I'm going to grab these two faces, and let's just say that like this is the width of our, little cutout in the center. I'm going to go ahead and edit mesh bridge this, and I'm going to make one division on the inside. And you'll see why I want this division in a minute. But once you do that, you can go in and select these little edges around the side, extrude them, and then, and then you can scale them in to the center. This is basically just remaking the flat part of the top, and if you merge this to center, what you can do is so make sure that the vertice is selected, and then press and hold V, and we can snap that in. And now we have basically, it's still a flat top, but we've changed the topology in a way that's desirable for working with as we go forward. So I'm going to go ahead and merge these to center. And then what we can do is grab, I'm going to do this from the side view actually. What we can do is grab all of the faces on the top of this. Oops, I was selecting the bottom. Apparently I've made this upside down. Alright, grab all the faces on the top of this, except these little faces in the middle. And then we can just grab these and extrude them up. And now we have a goofy little screw. Now there's decent amount of issues with this topology-wise, where we definitely need like an edge loop here. You also probably want to run an edge loop in the center here, which the way I set this up is actually not ideal. You could, if you wanted to, extrude another edge loop. It honestly might be easier at this point to just sort of multi-cut this in because I set it up so weird. And I'm not being terribly precise about this. The main reason that I want this here is just to prevent that like weird pulling in the top. But basically you'd have to go down and just like run that edge loop, I clicked the wrong spot, but you would want it to connect on either side, and it's a whole lot of fun. But now we have, this is still kind of broken. But you have, you know, that sort of weird screw shape. And in this particular case, like, strictly speaking, the little nubby bits on this aren't quite as round, or they're not quite as, yeah, they're not quite as rounded as this, but, like, effort. Not worth it in this case for this little screw. So that pretty much is little screws. Alternately, if you guys prefer to texture these little nubby things on, you're welcome to do that as well. Come the texturing week, you should at minimum model this thing for like the screwdriver to go into. But if you don't want to do this side nonsense, you can just leave that for texturing with like a bump map. That is completely fine. Are there any questions on this very weird button demo? Screw demo, whatever this thing is. All right. So I think the only other thing that I want to talk about, and if you guys did the hole punch, you will have seen this before, because this is how I did a lot of the hole punch. Let me find it. Wait. I'll get there. Hang on. Okay. Really? Somewhere. Here we go. This weird thing around the side. I know one or two hacks that'll make this way easier to model, so I just wanted to show you that really quick, because it'll be really quick. And then after that, like I said, I don't want to rehash this too much, because I do have it recorded, so you guys can reference that, you know, as needed. But for that goofy little handle thing around the side, what I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to start with a plane. And I'm actually going to add a plane on, I can figure out what the heck side I'm working on. Cool. So I'm just going to make, like I said, a random little plane. I'll center this on the origin just so I know that it's like centered in the middle of this thing. And I'm going to drag it out to the side. And once I've done that, what I'm going to do is grab, don't worry if this doesn't look like a proper object at this point, I'll fix that in a bit. So I'm just going for basically like the overall shape of this little, whatever this corner thing is. What shape is this actually? All right, actually I'm making this backwards, but we're gonna run with it. Same basic principle. So I just want this like straight thing with this little bend, and then again kind of going straight. If you try to poly model this, it can be like a little bit annoying. So what I'm gonna do is just block out again like the very basic shape of this, and then have this. I'll put it on the wrong side of the light so it's at least sort of the right shape. So we have this, and if we smooth it, it looks pretty goofy. If we look at this in this view, it still looks pretty gosh darn goofy. I'm going to turn off symmetry on this. So I'm just going to build one side of this for now, and then again, if we wanted to, we could mirror this over later. What the actual heck did I do? Why? Ew. Question mark. Okay. I don't know exactly what happened here, but in this case, what I can do to fix this is basically grab this edge. For some reason, it's flipped itself. So I'm going to use vertex snapping to just push that in line with the rest of this, since it's like a single uniformly wide strip of metal. No idea what happened there. So what I'm going to do is actually bevel these edges, and this I'm going to do with, let's say, pick settings that, you know, work for the reference, which I'm kind of winging right now. I'll bevel this edge as well, and maybe add in like, you do not need a lot of segments. Like 3 segments is probably all you need for this. But now you have the approximate shape of that object, and if you wanted to thicken this, all you would have to do is select the entire object and just extrude that out. And that is pretty much the easiest way that I know of to make that. Make sure that you mesh display reverse, and then you do have to go back and add those little edge loops in. But at this point, it should function pretty much like a cube, which sounds really weird, but basically this is just a wiggly cube. So what you should do, you probably only need to add like 6 or 7 loops into this. So we have 1, the lag. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then strictly speaking this would have another half, so you actually don't need one there. but that's pretty much the wiggly metal bit on the edge of that. And you can see that actually does a weirdly good job of even approximating the, there's like a bit of squish where the metal is being compressed. It kind of emulates that on the side there. But yeah, so like I said, I think that's pretty much most of what you need to get this done. There's also, if there's like a metal band running around the front of this thing, the easiest way to recreate that is start with a torus, and I'm going to blatantly ignore the overall size of this thing. I'm just going to center on the origin. Easiest way to recreate that metal band, if you want the nice sort of modeled edges in here, is grab half of this, extrude it out, and I'm just grabbing the faces right now. So grab half of those faces, Control E to extrude them out, and now you have that nice metal band, and what you can do then is very, very easily go over and just sort of like move this into whatever position you need. It's a very nice modular thing. Benefits of this is you don't need to do anything extra to make it smooth. You just get that nice sort of weird metal ring thing. Other tidbit, I guess, I'm just throwing a bunch of like weird modeling nuggets at you, I guess. So saying like I've made this and it's objectively too thick for what I want. If you need to make this thinner and you don't want to remake it, what you can do is extrude your whole object, go to wireframe mode, and just squish it in. And this does not work for every object, but for something like this, it will work very, very nicely. So extrude that in. Now you have basically two pieces of geometry just like hanging out in this. You have this like inner beam and this outer thing. Double click on the outer ring and just delete it. Now you have pretty much the same exact shape, just a thinner version of it. And then you can, move that into place wherever you need it. Actually, that also works for expanding this. At some point, you will reach a point where it, becomes a mesh issue. Like you can only do this so much before it starts clipping itself. But if you just need a mild expansion, you can do a pretty good amount of that before it'll break down. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that you would need to model this. So does anybody have any questions on anything that I've done so far, or does anybody want to see particular other parts of the light done? All right, cool. So like I said, in that case, that is pretty much all I had for you guys. If anyone's interested, I'm glad to sort of like stay after and like keep noodling with this. But like I said, I don't want to keep you here. It would be pretty much me just doing the same stuff over and over again, so I don't want to like force you to sit through that. So do check out some of the videos from this week. Here we go. Let's see here. For the modeling assignment, again, just make sure, I'll put this light up, and I'll link the tutorial here in case you guys want to reference it. Just make sure you're grabbing one of these 5 objects to do. Make sure, again, every object smooths with the 3 key. That's also how your final should be modeled, with everything smoothing with the 3 key. And that's pretty much that. So any other questions before I let you guys go? All right. Well, on that